So who wins this election and why? Well, let's start with where we start from, and that's after one key redistribution. The state of the House, as we enter this election campaign, the coalition effectively on 76 seats and Labor on 69. One seat went from the coalition in WA to Labor in Victoria. So we do see one seat change hands and the contest does tighten ever so slightly. And where we're at, we're going to look at a lot of two-party preferred and apply various swings. So remember where we're at from that election campaign. The coalition got 51.5% of two-party preferred vote and Labor 48.5%. So applying various swings, what if we get a 50-50% result on that 2PP? Well, we have 73 to the coalition, 72 from Labor. You might think, well, of course, an even result, a pretty equal number of seats. It's not always the case. 1998, the coalition lost two-party preferred 49 to 51, ended up with 80 seats compared to Labor's 67. That won't happen this time around. Yes, it won't necessarily be a uniform swing, but you see it is likely to be a very tight result if it is 50-50. If we apply 55-45, you see a drastically different result. We've seen Labor hit this mark many times over the past few months, and it's worth remembering. This is likely an election that goes down to a seat-by-seat contest, but at 55-45, it won't. The seats will be out there, they'll fall, and there'll be seats outside of the radars of the two major parties right now. So worth remembering, don't worry about seats at 55-45, but at 52-48 towards Labor, it's very much a contest. Look, mainly on Labor's terms, it would be the one being able to get a majority here, but that majority would not be assured. Uniform swing again, but the barest possible majority for Labor on that 52-48 basis. And if there are a few surprise results, you could see the two major parties vying for minority government on that 52-48 basis. Newspoll has been dire though for the government, and in several areas when we look at the last quarterly analysis that was done. For example, on gender, male and female voters, both 55-45. So Scott Morrison has spoken about a lot that perhaps he has a problem with female voters. Well, on this basis, he has a problem with male and female voters. What about on age? Well, here you see perhaps more of a natural cohort for the Labor Party, 18 to 34, 66 to 34. So sure, you might think that makes some sense, but it's the other age groups that are a worry. The coalition wants to capture more of the 35 to 49-year-olds. They're only getting 40% of those at the moment. 50 to 64-year-olds, 50-50. You might think that's a better result, but this cohort normally is stronger for the coalition. And 65 plus, again, you say, well, the coalition's 58 to 42 up here. Well, they had a better result according to opinion polling last time. So even this 65 plus result at the moment is a better one, an improvement for Labor. Income is a similar story, except in this case, Labor is winning all of these brackets. Yes, by different amounts. So the best one the coalition is doing is that $100,000 to $149,000 income for total household income, and that is the middle income bracket that both major parties really want to go after. Remember, Labor with a lot of extra tax policies last time around, they really hurt in these regions in terms of middle and higher income brackets. They're doing a lot better this time around. And yes, the lower income bracket is very strong for Labor. That's more expected. So when we look at the polling, you might think last time around we had a lot of opinion polls that said Labor were likely to win the election. Can't they just be wrong again? Let's compare last time around. This is the Newspoll immediately after the budget in 2019. You can see Labor leading 52 to 48. A pretty narrow lead. That is within the sort of margin where a campaign can flip things. This time around, this is the same period. This is the Newspoll straight after the budget. This time around, it's 54-46. It's another 2% in two-party preferred. That's a significant difference between last time and this time. Also, what's happening in methodology, and a lot of different companies have changed their methodology, including YouGov, which does Newspoll. It's 100% online. This is where people's lives are now. It's also better at weighting. Now, last time polling companies spoke about missing some cohorts, in particular higher income earners that were not perhaps tertiary educated. This time around, they say they're waiting for this. They're not missing voter cohorts. Also, better identification of voters using postcodes to make sure they know where they're voting. Some people don't realise the seat they're actually in. And the polling method. Having essentially something that mirrors what happens on polling day, something similar to a ballot paper, so you get someone's true two-party preferred preference, not just which party they think they like before they get that option within the polling booth type scenario. So what does all this actually result in? Well, two fairly accurate results for Newspoll in the last two state elections. WA, for example, 68% to 32, two-party preferred was the result just before that election. People thought that's way too high. How can that be accurate? Well, it turned out to be slightly unders. This is the election result, 69.7 versus 30.3. That's quite an accurate result in WA. South Australia as well, a similar scenario, 56.44 felt very high, considering it was an incumbent government during COVID. As it turned out, they were turfed out, 54.4% versus 45.6%. Now again, this is not exactly on the money, but this is the sort of error that we're used to polling getting, in the order of 1% or slightly higher. And that means if you have a scenario where Labor's up 53, 54 on the day, and the final poll that comes in, you can be fairly well assured that they are going to have that positive result. How this actually played out as well in South Australia. So something around where the polls are at right now for Labor federally. How did that play out in a state result? Well, it did two things. First of all, for marginal seats for the Labor Party, they needed to win 4 marginal seats to get power in South Australia. How did that play out? Let's look at two of them. King, for example, Labor's primary vote there going way up. You can see a lot of primaries up here, by the way. That's because SA Best, the Nick Xenophon party, wasn't running. So who was going to get that primary vote from Nick Xenophon was always the question. It's mostly the Labor Party. In this seat, it's a relatively narrow victory for Labor, but comfortable enough. That's one of the marginal seats they needed to win. Let's have a look at another one, Adelaide, and this is without SA Best, so you get a better idea for what was happening in this election. Liberal Party bleeding 7.5%, Labor picking up 4%, a bit of the rest spread around. But what it resulted in this particular seat, an easy win for Labor in a seat that was supposed to be tight, perhaps only a couple of weeks out from the election. So picking up the marginals, that's the first thing you do with that 55-45 result. You pick up basically all the marginals you were hoping to get, and then you get seats further along the electoral pendulum, if you like. Davenport was held by about 10% by the Liberal Party. Not spoken about a lot by either major party until very late on the election campaign. Look at the result. Slight loss from the Liberal Party, 15% up for the Labor Party, hoovering up that SA Best vote. How it actually played out once you go to two-party preferred, a comfortable enough win, particularly in a seat that was 10% behind for Labor. The other one, Wait, and this one's a bit more complicated on primary. You had an independent that previously held another seat coming into this seat, so Sam Dullock there, confusing things a little bit. But the main point is a big drop in the number in terms of that Liberal vote. And where did that go in terms of preferences? Again, a relatively comfortable victory for the Labor Party in that seat. So picking up the marginals easily enough and picking up some seats further down the pendulum. That 55-45 result, if we're talking that two-party preferred, the seats appear. You might not know exactly where they are every time, but they do pop up. So how does Scott Morrison win this time? Does he have the same path is a key question. We saw him do it last time. I've covered the opinion poll side of things and why that indicates it won't be the same way he can do it this time around. It's also around the contest between these two leaders. Now, we've heard a lot about Labor's policies and the fact they've jettisoned those policies to have extra taxes on various people through the economy, but the personal popularity is a big one as well. Bill Shorten, even though he got Labor to a solid lead in the polls through that electoral cycle, a lead that did diminish towards the election, by the way, but his personal popularity was never actually a weapon. When we look at that again and compare that to the final Newspoll after the budget in 2019 and the final Newspoll after this budget as well. So again, we're comparing like for like. Scott Morrison in April 2019 was +2 in positive territory. Bill Shorten was -14, so a 16 percentage point gap between the two leaders. Then this time around, Scott Morrison, he's lost skin in the eyes of a lot of voters. He's -12%, and Anthony Albanese is -1%. Now, there is something to say beyond this figure. He has just slipped back into negative territory, Anthony Albanese. So is it the start of a trend as people look at him more closely? We'll see. But also that some of the support for Labor is soft. And pollsters are saying this right across the spectrum. Some of the internal polling done, some of the published polling. There is soft support for Labor, so that can still change. These numbers can change during the election. And even though Scott Morrison doesn't need a lead in this to win, that sort of lead to Anthony Albanese makes it very difficult to win an election when you're suffering that much in popularity. Another big factor, Clive Palmer and his cash. Now, last time around, he spent $80 million in 2019. This was essentially all targeting Labor and Bill Shorten and Labor's policies. This time around so far, we're seeing him target incumbents mainly and spreading around his dislike, if you like. So if he was targeting just Labor last time and this time he's targeting everybody, essentially that is an advantage to Labor. How will that actually present? Well, key marginal seats, including in Queensland, and we'll see how he actually suggests his preferences should go. We'll see how much the party actually hands out how to vote cards, but we saw the result in 2019 really affect Labor. In 2019, Labor's, for example, primary in Queensland was down about 4%, but crucially preferences from One Nation and United Australia Party after this big campaign from Clive Palmer, normally they flow roughly 50-50 to Labor and the coalition. In that election, they were flowing about 65-35 to the coalition, so Labor was losing votes and also losing further on the preference count. That could have been crucial in that 2019 result to determining Longman, Leichhardt and Flynn, just to name three. So you're seeing the possibility, if that flips this time around, of a much better result for Labor in 2022 in Queensland. Now they have some high margins to contend with, but Clive Palmer could help them, just because he's disliking everybody this time around, have a better result in Queensland and possibly some other seats around the country as well. It's always worth looking at primary. We're looking a lot at two-party preferred because then we can apply the swing and see where it's at. But let's remember where primary was. So this is comparing the primary vote in the last published Newspoll, just after the budget again, with the primary at the last election, the actual primary vote. You can see the coalition down 5 and Labor up 5 and the rest looks steady. There's a bit more going on than that. The Greens have been lower, for example, over the past few months. They have bumped up. Labor's just lost 3 points on its primary as well. That will be a watch. 3 points is a fair bit to lose in a primary vote from one poll to another. So it might be a little bit of a concern, but 2 points has gone to the Greens and 1 to the coalition. So not a massive concern just yet, but primary matters. The lower this gets, obviously, for Labor, even if they maintain the same two-party preferred lead, the lower this gets, the harder it would be for them to form a majority. But they can form it from 38. Putting a number, an exact number on the primary, what that needs to be to win a majority is problematic. But let's just say right now that's a lot to lose for the coalition as well, 5% on that. And also, let's not talk up too much United Australia Party. 3% last time, 3% this time. Other issues, other headwinds, if you like, for Scott Morrison has been the Liberal pre-selection. It's finally been sorted out, of course, but it is going to cost them. Months ago, we had coalition strategists saying they could probably take 3 or 4 of these seats and they could offset losses around the rest of the country in New South Wales and have that path back to a majority. That's become more problematic. Warringah is seen as Zali Steggall's now to lose. She's a very strong chance to retain that seat. 2nd of April is when we finally got a Liberal candidate pre-selected, and even then it had an asterisk because they had to go through that legal action to finally clarify that. So that delay is costly there. Dobell, 11th of March, that's when we finally got a Liberal Party candidate there. So that long delay, that seat's gone from something there was confidence of from the Liberal side to now saying, well, it's in play, hopeful. Parramatta, again, you can see 2nd of April, so that long delay in pre-selection. Labor parachuted a candidate in, of course, Andrew Charlton, and a few controversial headlines. And the point about that is, can the Liberal Party actually run a good campaign against him, given they've had such a late pre-selection? So Parramatta goes from perhaps right in play to, we'll just keep an eye on it. Greenway, perhaps with an early pre-selection, might have been a shot. Neither side thinks that will fall now. Michelle Rowland seen as a very good local campaigner. Gilmore, you can see this is the earliest pre-selection on this board. So 16th of January, Andrew Constance, perhaps no coincidence. It's seen as the most likely to fall of Labor seats in New South Wales. So that one was done in time, if you like, compared to the others. Eden Monero, another one. Now, if you look at Eden Monero, Christy McBain only won that in the by-election. Mike Kelly won for Labor last time at the election proper. So if you like, Christy McBain's support hasn't been properly tested in an election, and given that margin, it was seen as a big shot. But again, such a late pre-selection, the chances of the Liberal Party winning that seat and these others with delayed pre-selections has gone down significantly. We are looking at some new battlegrounds as well in this election that perhaps weren't big battlegrounds last time around. Let's begin with the Hunter region. The federal government has made this one of its 4 regional hubs in the last budget, so that does show there's money flowing around. And let's quickly talk these seats. So Hunter, Joel Fitzgibbon is stepping down, a margin of 3%. But there's a couple of factors here in Labor's favour. The One Nation vote was 21.5% last time. That favoured the coalition. They have a different candidate. They're not expecting to poll as high this time around. So that helps Labor. And they feel like they've got a good candidate there, an ex-Olympian shooter as well, that will go well in the region. Patterson's increasingly on the watch list from both sides. Meryl Swanson, seen as a good grassroots member. Brooke Vitnell, though, a fresh young face with the Liberal Party, with connections to the Prime Minister's office, so perhaps a bit of campaigning there will help her as well. And Shortland, Pat Conroy there, it's more of a coastal seat, less of a coal-affected seat, if you like. So just on the watch list, not as big a concern as Patterson. And you can tell from Labor that they were a bit concerned by Patterson by the backflip on Kurri Kurri, that gas-fired power station. They initially said they wouldn't support the government money for that gas-fired power station. They decided they would. Clearly a sign they were a bit worried about Patterson. There are other issues, though, for the Liberal Party in some of these new battlegrounds. Sydney's beachside, so Warringah, we've spoken about that already. Wentworth and Dave Sharma, he's facing a big campaign and a high spending one by Allegra Spender. That's very strongly on the watch list. We'll see what happens there. Hughes, not too worried about that. Craig Kelly is not going to cause the government too much trouble. Mackellar's a very interesting one. Climate change has been a big focus for Sophie Scamps. This is another Climate 200 candidate, the same as Warringah, Wentworth and North Sydney as well. And she has volunteers and cash to spend in that seat. So that's become something on the watch list, if not yet the concern list. North Sydney is a big watch. Trent Zimmerman there up against a Labor candidate and a Climate 200 candidate as well, Catherine Renshaw and Kylie Tink. So North Sydney seen as right in play. These are the sorts of seats 2 or 3 elections ago you'd say lay down misere for the Liberal Party. Now they're going to have to spend time and money to fend off some of these challenges from independents. There's a bit of that happening in Victoria as well. It's not as big a concern for the coalition at the moment. Casey, you've got Tony Smith stepping down, and for that reason it's a bit of a watch. I don't think it's a big concern right now for the Liberal Party. Deakin, Michael Sukkar seems pretty solidly entrenched there. Goldstein here, Tim Wilson, again, he's facing a Climate 200 candidate. Zoe Daniel, journalist, relatively large profile, so that will be an interesting campaign. His margin should see him through, is the feeling, but it's in play. It's on radars. Higgins is an interesting one. You've got the Liberal Party holding that. A pretty decent swing against Katie Allen last time around. Labor has pre-selected a doctor. The Liberal Party already running a bit of a campaign there on what she had to say, the Labor candidate, on AstraZeneca. But that margin suggests it's going to be an interesting contest. And Kooyong will be a huge watch, of course. Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, Monique Ryan as the Independent. Last time around, Josh Frydenberg was challenged and that margin came right down to 6.4% because of the Greens. This time the Greens essentially running dead to give space to Monique Ryan, who also is a doctor in that particular seat. So it's a watch. The feeling is the Liberal Party and Josh Frydenberg know this time around this challenge has been coming and they're better prepared. But there are some changing demographics, higher density housing in there, younger people moving in that won't necessarily help him. So it's a big watch, albeit the margin is still relatively comfortable. So that's another battleground area. And this one in particular is interesting for one reason. Not so much Solomon, that's basically Darwin and surrounds, but the rest of the Northern Territory. It's very difficult, given how remote parts of it are, to get any sort of accurate polling. You have a lot of voters here who are not registered yet, and you have Labor, this is the biggest factor in this, Warren Snowden, is stepping down, a long-time member of this seat, so it does mean this seat is up for grabs. I don't think we'll know a lot about that definitively until we get booths coming in on the night, but it's certainly a watch in the Northern Territory. Is this going to be the rise of the independents? This is a question. It was spoken about last time and it didn't really happen, but it's worth looking at because you do go to 2013, a huge majority for Tony Abbott and the coalition. Since then, we've had the coalition 76, 77 seats squeaking over the line and Labor Party in the high 60s. What's happening so far is we've had 5 and 6 independents, but this time around, more organised, more money, more candidates out there as well, and more seats in which they're given a chance. The downside for the independents at the moment is there don't seem to be seats that anyone's saying will definitively fall or are a very, very strong chance, just some danger signs. So will they get all the way up to 10? We will see. I think it's worth watching because the higher they get, the harder it is for either major party to get that majority government. Is that going to be a trend in politics? We'll see. It's worth keeping a close eye on the rise of the independents, though, for that very reason. So if we wake up on the day after the election and the coalition has won, why will we be saying they won? because of cost of living and interest rates. And yes, cost of living is hitting already, and that's with the coalition in power, but they're going to be trying to run this campaign that Labor will spend more money, worry about Labor being in power and how that flows through to interest rates. That Anthony Albanese, even though he's not as unpopular as Scott Morrison, certainly right now, that he also wasn't a popular leader and there was that soft support we spoke about. That national security has been a big issue. Defence, China, geopolitics, Ukraine. The coalition will be running hard on that. It doesn't mean they win the day on it, but they're making it a big part of their election campaign. And this statistic down here, 3%. So these marginal seats we're talking about, and this is a fascinating statistic from this election that actually happened from 2019. We saw Labor have a lot of seats margins for them tighten and the coalition get more space on theirs. For seats that are 3% or under in terms of that margin, the coalition have 3 of them at this campaign and Labor have 13, so 3 versus 13. And that does show if there's a weak swing towards Labor, you could still see some of those seats that are in those very low margins with very targeted campaigning going towards the coalition. So it's worth keeping that in mind when you're applying these various swings. If we wake up and Anthony Albanese has become the Prime Minister-elect, these will be the factors. Number 1, with a bullet, Scott Morrison being an unpopular leader, having a lot of baggage, and that being a very different situation to 2019. Health as well, bolstering that 65+ vote. We saw that happen in particular in Queensland, people worried about COVID, about new variants, whatever it might be, and Labor trying to run the campaign of them being better to be able to manage that situation in whatever area it might be. The government's competence in general, we've heard Scott Morrison say this is not a referendum on the government. Labor wants it to be. They feel as though if it is, they're in the box seat. So this debate around whether or not this is all about the government. And just finally, wages. This is more what Labor wants to talk about this time, in particular compared to last time. That last time they were talking about how we divide the pie, if you like, and various tax measures they were taking. This time around, they've ditched essentially all of them except multinational tax. Even recently, any potential for more taxes on trusts. So they want to talk about wages. Perhaps we'll hear their plan on wage increases fleshed out beyond things such as the gig economy. But that is something they'll be talking about and hoping to win voters over as a result of. When we just get a look at battleground seats and you get an idea for how this contest goes, these are the main 24, you could argue, that will decide the election, and you can see the blue versus the red. And that's just a simple demonstration of the number of seats the coalition will be trying to sandbag, hang on to, and the number Labor can attack. So there are a total there of 16 that are blue and 8 that are red. So you see the mismatch in terms of defence versus offence in this particular election. I think you get a better demonstration here for how it's won state by state and why it comes down to New South Wales. If we take in the Northern Territory, Queensland, South Australia and WA, you can see it's blue for the NT, so there's a possible gain there for the coalition. These other 3, they're not going to be gains for the coalition. It's a question of how much ground Labor makes. 2 seems a pretty solid figure in WA, 1 likely in South Australia, not locked in. Queensland's interesting. There's a possibility no seats go given the margins, but there could be 2 or 3 to the ALP, depending on how this plays out. And let's add in Tassie, 1 could go either way, Victoria 3, 2 to 3 either way at the most. The point around taking all those seats before you get to New South Wales is you have different scenarios. Yes, Labor could be sitting on the cusp of a majority, maybe up to sort of 75, 76 seats, or they could be on sort of 72, 73. But once you get to New South Wales, that result there could either wipe out the Labor gains or reaffirm them. Same for the coalition. They could get to New South Wales needing to win 3, 4, 5 seats, and that is still possible in New South Wales. The only advantage here on this map for the coalition is they have more winnable seats in New South Wales, but they still need a swing towards them, and you've got to keep that in your back of your mind. But for this reason, when you see the relatively low ability for the coalition to win any seats outside New South Wales, and also the smaller exchanges of seats, a lot of this election comes down to New South Wales. If you're there, expect some campaign buses to head your way plenty of times. Seats set to change hands, none of these are locks. Probably the biggest question mark at the moment would be Chisholm, but let's just deal with seats that would likely change hands if we see some sort of swing to Labor, and perhaps it's a slightly muted one. New South Wales, North Sydney and Reid, let's assume they go. WA, Swan and Pearce, fairly reliable that they'll go. South Australia and Victoria, I spoke about them, Boothby and Chisholm. And then you get to New South Wales and Tasmania, and we're giving these seats back to the coalition. None of these are locked in, but we're just talking about seats quite likely to change hands if there are no real surprises. If that's the end of it, if it's a much tighter result than we were thinking and we're in this position, suddenly you get to this, 72 and 72. And yes, this is one hypothetical, but there's every chance this can happen. At this point, you begin to look at the crossbench. What happens in that hung parliament situation? For Labor, they can get two very easily. The expectation is Andrew Wilkie, Adam Bandt would give them supply and confidence without having to horse trade necessarily or form any sort of actual minority government. Can't imagine Labor going down that path again. So Labor has a slight advantage when you look at this on first glance. You'd have to say Bob Katter's lean LNP. Look, he's spoken about possibly supporting Labor and having a close personal relationship with Anthony Albanese, but at the same time, we know what he did last time this situation popped up. We know what his electorate is like. So let's put two there and one to the LNP. I think what this indicates is who's ahead on that hung parliament situation. If Labor's even level or ahead, they're in the box seat to form a minority government. You'd think the coalition would have to be ahead of Labor in seats to have a chance of forming a minority government that would have a chance of holding together, if you like. Why is that? Well, these other four seats are interesting. You've got former Liberal seats, but you've also got this Climate 200 movement. Their main reason to be, according to them, is climate change. Labor for now has a more ambitious policy on it. So how does the Liberal Party win them over if they say that was their main reason for getting votes? Do they have a more ambitious climate policy? Can they get support from the Nationals to actually do that? If Scott Morrison's leader, who knows, if Josh Frydenberg's leader, whatever the case might be, how would that scenario play out? Would the independents try to force, for example, Josh Frydenberg to become leader? It gets messy is the point. In a hung parliament, it's a narrower, more difficult path for the coalition versus Labor, unless the coalition has a lead in terms of the number of seats, and a clear lead as well. We talk about different seats, where they're targeting, and what sides are saying they're targeting. Perhaps you get a better indication from where the leaders are actually going. This is over the past couple of months or so. Lindsay 4 visits. It's not being spoken about a lot, but it's being visited. So maybe there is more concern from the coalition on that. Then we go to Reid, Chisholm and 2 Labor ones at the end. So you can tell there's more targeting of sandbagging for Scott Morrison. Perhaps not a big surprise. For Anthony Albanese, for now, it's all about Liberal seats. These are his most visited seats, including Robertson, on the Central Coast. That would be a good get for the Labor Party. The point is he's going on the attack at the moment, including Boothby and Chisholm, those ones we listed off earlier. If you combine the two, you get all Liberal seats that are being visited the most. It's not to say we won't see some more visits to Labor seats. There are some very much in play, but you get the point from the trends here that both of them see a lot of the action in Liberal seats and whether they fall or whether they don't. Just remembering where we're at in this overall scheme of things, it is a solid Labor lead still, 54 to 46. It tightened 1 point, but it's a long way back for the coalition from this point. The biggest thing about this, and all sides agree on this, there is still a soft Labor element here, and there is an expectation things will tighten somewhat during the election campaign. What does all of this mean? It means the campaign will matter this year. The election campaign will decide any of the results that are still on the table, and all of them are. There could be a coalition minority or majority. You'd rather be in Labor's shoes right now. There could also be a Labor minority or a majority. But don't miss a minute of the campaign, because in 2022, it will matter.